Today on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation with war nerd Gary Brecher, columnist in the eXile and author of War Nerd, new from Soft Skull Press. Gary Brecher is the war nerd, the man behind the column of the same name that since 2002 has reviewed war with an enthusiast's dedication in the eXile, Moscow's alternative English language paper. Gary, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
There's war coverage everywhere. There's war coverage in the news, in countless magazines, on the billion channels, in blogs. What about War Nerd gets its fervent following? What brings people to War Nerd above other sources?
I don't lie as much as the others do. It's really that simple. And I've studied guerrilla war and irregular warfare, which most of the people reporting on war haven't. You put those together with the fact that I don't root for the home team and blind myself to reality as much as most people do, and I guess that accounts for whatever following I got.
Could you call yourself objective in that way?
Well, I try to be. I guess an objective human being would probably end up in an insane asylum, I guess, if you were totally objective. But it helps to have an imagination, I'd say. Like, if you want to understand what's going on in Iraq, imagine that the Chinese army was occupying your neighborhood. Imagine they came in with all the best intentions in the world, or at least told you they did. But when they weren't talking about their best intentions, people were getting shot and blown up. I mean, if you can imagine that, you can imagine Iraq a lot better. I think most people just aren't willing to think that people in the war zones around the world are anything like they are. And that has two sides. One is realizing that Iraqis are just ordinary people, including the suicide bombers. The other is realizing that if you look a little harder at the people you know, you'll see that they're tribalists just like everybody else. I mean, the people I grew up with, they don't give a about democracy. You know, like that song from Team America, America, yeah, so kiss my and suck on my. That's more like how most people I know feel, and that's normal throughout the world.
Do you think that wars all reduce to tribalism?
Well, I don't know that they reduce to it, but I think it's a component people might like to take a little more seriously. I mean, not because tribalism is the one word that explains everything, but because it gets bound up with a lot of other stuff. It gets bound up with religion, it gets bound up with money. You can take the sort of Marxist professor approach and say it's all about money, but I don't know. When you ask that old question, who benefits? A lot of the time the answer is nobody, or the people who didn't get involved in the war. So I think tribalism accounts for some of what other people would just dismiss as craziness. Like I read other people about the Middle East, say Robert Fisk and those people, and they won't admit that there is such a thing as tribalism. So they end up saying, here's a history of endless betrayal and massacre and horror, and therefore people should be nice to each other. Well, what do you mean should? Where's that should coming from? What makes you think they will be?
They just kind of put out there what their prescription is and leave it at that?
Yeah, and if they looked a little harder about their own record, like Fisk is a big fan of the British Empire. My God, the things those people did. And they didn't lose any sleep about it. Only difference is Americans kill you and cry about it. The Brits kill you and never lose a minute's sleep.
You've written about this before when a commentator will say something like, they'll talk about an African war and they'll call it senseless, and you claim that, correct me if I'm wrong, they just don't want to understand Africans?
Yeah, no, that's right. I think that's really true. I mean, imagine that whatever local rivalry you ever been part of was multiplied by about 1,000 times because you didn't have an overall national army like you do in the U.S. You didn't have any peacekeeping forces. Imagine that your village and the village over the hill have hated each other forever, and they've got some stuff that you'd really like, and you wouldn't mind taking a few of their cute women as well. And you know, if you don't do it, they may do it to you. So you do it first. It may not be pretty, but I don't see how you can call it irrational.
Why don't more mainstream commentators want to put themselves in the shoes or, whatever they're wearing on their feet of these people fighting in irregular warfare in the third world and so on?
I've wondered about that. I mean, it's a good question, but I can't say I really know. I think part of it is it's depressing, and it happens in places, and it happens to people that they don't care much about. So it's a lot more comfortable pretending that your life in D.C. or Manhattan or wherever has no connection with those lives. And in a way, you can pretend that because you've got paid soldiers to do your killing for you. Those people don't have the paid soldiers to do their killing for you. They got to do it themselves.
Would you say this is more a case of the actual reporters not wanting to get into it, or the readership of whatever outlet?
Yeah, that's a good question. Is it just that people don't want to hear that? I think there's a lot of that, too. How many people want to know? When I started switching, I used to hang out with some D&D people, I guess, like the closest thing to friends I had, I guess. And when I was like the local military hardware guy, they all loved me when they could ask me about tanks and shit. But when I started getting into irregular warfare, they were all bummed out. They didn't want to know.
They wanted to know about what the cool stuff was, the cool steel that was rolling out, but not the actual psychology to the war itself.
Yep. Not wars that were, these wars don't have battles. That's something I have to keep telling people. The idea of a primitive war is not to go out and have a battle with the other tribes. The idea is to sack a village when the men are away or the men are asleep, so you don't lose too many people, and kill as many of them as you can without losing too many of your guys. I mean, it's not that far from some glorious American military victories, say. That's what we did at Bunker Hill, That's what we did at New Orleans. The idea of a lot of war is to kill a bunch of their guys without killing any of your guys. Well, one way to do that, if it's village versus village, is to go in there while the men are away in the fields or the men are asleep and, get those machetes working.
Would you say that in the major wars, the people, let's say in this country, think of as glorious or semi-glorious, what have you, do they think of them as being more symmetrical than they actually were? Was there more asymmetrical warfare going on in your mind than actually people remember today?
Absolutely. I mean, when you have air superiority, it's the ultimate asymmetrical warfare. In most wars, we've had air superiority. In fact, nobody in America, and good for us, nobody in America knows what it's like to be under aerial bombardment, It's not very pretty. Some of the VC, who are the toughest people I can think of, they just went crazy if they survived B-52 strikes. They couldn't speak. They couldn't be human beings ever again. If you were in a city like Japan when we dropped incendiary bombs on a city made out of wood and paper and burned, 100,000 odd people, that was pretty asymmetrical warfare. It was a B-29 fleet versus a few crummy anti-aircraft guns manned by the dregs of what was left of the Japanese army. If you were in Dresden, where the Brits dropped incendiary bombs on a non-military city with 250,000 refugees in it, they fried them. They literally fried them in the asphalt. And I would call that asymmetrical warfare if we're going to get snooty about it.
Now, you've got a new book out collecting the columns. The book itself is also called War Nerd, and you include the column The Doctrine of Asymmetrical War toward the end, and we already talked about the first myth you tackle, which is war involves battles. The second one, you win by killing the enemy. Why don't you win by killing the enemy?
Well, you can, that's a little a little trickier, because obviously if you kill them all, you win. But these days, outright genocide just isn't practical for most armies. I mean, sooner or later, I think it will come back. Sooner or later, some first world army, and who knows who it'll be 50 years from now, India or China, will just deploy neutron bombs to get rid of some local ethnic areas giving them trouble. But for now, genocide isn't practical. So just killing a bunch of people and leaving a lot of them still alive just produces angry cousins, angry little brothers, angry dads and sons, and increasingly, daughters and wives who are willing to go out there and avenge the dead. The only time just killing them all works is when you've got small, easily identifiable rebel population. The Chinese in Malaysia that the Brits killed off, the middle-class leftists in El Salvador that we killed off, and the Chechens that the Russians are killing off pretty effectively right now, because there's only 1 million-odd Chechens, so you can do that. But with a bigger population like, say, Iraq, at least 25 million people, It's just not practical.
If you can't win by killing the enemy, or at least can't practically win that way, what option is left to you?
I spent a lot of time thinking about that, and it's hard not to sound sort of flippant about this. It's like, well, don't go in there. Don't do that. I guess the flippant way I've sort of simplified that is bribe them, nuke them, or leave them alone. If you don't have the will to nuke them, then drop money on them. Because if you look, for example, at Thailand, that's the classic example of people who had like 5 insurgencies going in different parts of the country in the 1960s, and then suddenly everybody came and wanted, hotels and Thai food and diving lessons, and suddenly Thais could make real money, and they pretty much lost interest in swapping malaria parasites with Pol Pot out in the jungle.
Your third myth is that high-tech beats low-tech. How does low-tech win?
By intelligence, by changing the war from set-piece battle to spy versus spy and ambush. This is something that goes back to the early 20th century. A lot of argument about who started it. Like the Irish say Michael Collins started it with, where he said, you guys are idiots to keep trying to fight the British Army. You can't take a bunch of amateurs with guns and fight the Army. What you do is you put out their eyes. You kill the spies. And his big operation was killing 14 British spies at the same time one morning. He had a great line, too. He's a funny guy. He said, these whores have got to learn an Irishman can be on time. So he killed them all at exactly 9 o'clock. So the idea is when the Army has no intelligence, and that's what we were doing until at least until the surge in Iraq, you could see what happens. We drive around blind, and somebody blows up an IED under a Bradley or a tank, and we don't know who did it. At which point the soldiers they have all this firepower, but what do they do with it? They don't know who to shoot. So either they don't shoot at all, which drives them completely insane and would drive anybody insane, or they fire blind into the slums. And when they do, they hit somebody, and his or her little brother becomes an insurgent. So that's what you do, and it's a cruel, cruel method of warfare on both sides. That's one thing people have to understand, too. You can't romanticize guerrillas. Like Rambo is a way of romanticizing, ooh, we get to be the guerrillas this time. Yeah, well, you'll notice that in that movie, Rambo doesn't have any family. He's over in Vietnam all by himself. Most guerrillas have family, or they used to. And when they go into guerrilla war, they have to accept most of that family is going to die in pretty horrible ways. That's the price you pay.
Is that the primary factor behind the problems the U.S. is having in Iraq? They're getting hit with low-tech, smarter strategies, and they don't know how to respond?
Yeah. There's a Colonel Nagel in the U.S. Army who said, at the beginning of the war, American officers knew more about the battles of the U.S. Civil War than they did about counterinsurgency. Now, that's pretty shameful, especially when you're going to go fight a counterinsurgency war. But, lies build on lies. The first lie was there won't be an insurgency. Truth is, nobody likes being occupied by a foreign army. That's childish to think they're going to welcome you. So when the insurgency happened, nobody knew what to do about it. Basic doctrine in the U.S. Army is massive firepower. You cannot use massive firepower to fire blind into the slums. It makes 10 enemies for every one it kills. So we didn't have any doctrine. What the surge amounts to is just applying common sense, well-worn, counterinsurgency strategies. When you use those, you can wound an insurgency. Easy to wound an insurgency. Very, very hard to kill it.
How do you think the surge is doing in that regard?
I think it's, it gets a C. That is, about average. Because before that, we were getting F-, the worst counterinsurgency performance I've ever seen by a major power. I was just blown away how bad it was. They just didn't want to fight that kind of war, and it was like, no, we're not going to fight that kind of war. And if you keep doing it to us, we'll just ignore you. Ridiculous. So Petraeus, I'll give him credit. He's read the books, and he's got, I hear, these tame academics with him, tame anthropologists who tell him the basic stuff that anybody who's studied this knows, like insurgency runs in families. You got to find out which families are involved, and you got to either bribe them or kill them off.
This actually, it kind of covers number 4 as well, the fourth myth of overwhelming force, that if you hit hard enough, they'll quit. And what you're saying is you hit hard enough and 10 more rise in the place of 1, correct?
Yeah, depending on where you are. I mean, if you hit Denmark hard enough, they'd stop. If you've got a peaceful middle-class European country, it's probably they'll stop. If you've got a country that's sort of got a younger demographic profile, a lot of hot-headed 17-year-olds. A lot of this has to do with birth rate, actually. I mean, if you've got a high birth rate, you'll usually create a lot of enemies. I'm not saying killing a lot of people never works. Clearly it works sometimes, but only with older, scareder countries.
That's a theme in your work, is that birth rate is just a big help when it comes to fighting a war, when it comes to defending in a war. How well do you think that rule holds? Is it always a huge advantage, or just in some areas, in some kinds of wars?
Yeah, well, it's a huge advantage now. It wasn't always. A big birth rate can be crippling if you have to feed those mouths and you don't have a way to feed them. But right now, we've got this sort of half-assed aid system where we give people just barely enough to keep them alive and pissed off, and that makes guerrilla warfare kind of an attractive option.
So if the aid stopped, that might be an improvement.
I'm not saying stop the aid, but I'm saying, yeah, if you stopped medical and food aid to a lot of guerrilla countries, they'd have to devote a lot more energy to surviving, and that birth rate would become a liability. Yeah, it used to be done that way. I mean, I'm not saying do this. I'm just saying if you understand history, famine is a weapon. Even in Somalia, Americans didn't understand at the time, but when our soldiers got killed in Somalia, and this is explained pretty well by that book Black Hawk Down, what they were trying to do was get an aid convoy through, and what I was try to stop the aid convoy from getting through, so that they could starve the other clan out of existence.
You generally agree with the book Black Hawk Down's assessment of Somalia?
I thought it was pretty good. Yeah, for a mainstream book, for a bestseller. Yeah, especially because it explained that some people in Somalia, some Americans in Somalia, realized we've been dealing with the wrong model of human nature here, and I think that's really important. People don't want peace; they want victory.
And so we're going to get to number 5 now. People want democracy and peace and all that kind of stuff being your 5th myth. Was Somalia the point that started to get recognized?
If it did, I don't think it did. If it had, then why are we in Iraq? I mean, wasn't that supposed to be, we'll give them democracy and instantly they'll turn into Ohio? I seem to remember a lot of crap like that getting talked. I don't think anybody learned anything. I guess that's one thing you learn from studying wars. People don't learn very much. But yeah, you could have learned that if you'd wanted from Somalia. If you'd wanted to learn that, you could have learned.
And where does that myth come from, do you think?
Every people loves itself. Like, there's an old saying, we're very popular with ourselves. It happens to be one of the terms in our myth. Democracy is what's so good about us, so everybody has to want to be like us. And that's why I try to keep it sort of fair here. I don't just say, those people don't want democracy. I say, look around with the people you hang with. Do they want democracy? Do they care? Where I come from, like I've said before, politics is about real estate development. Nobody I know gave a damn about it unless there was money in it because you needed to get your land zoning change approved. That's California politics as far as I know it. And I don't see what it has to do with democracy.
For those who haven't read your column, I guess I should mention that the Fresno setting that you describe is a big part of your whole persona. Maybe you should describe a little bit about what Fresno's like for someone who's never been there.
Hot, flat, and weird. I guess one thing that's important about Fresno is it's a weird mix of sort of, I don't know what you'd call my people, church-going country people or rednecks, or call them whatever you want. But along with them, there's a bunch of Mexicans and there's a bunch of much rarer groups, like Armenians were big in the history of Fresno, and they did really well. They got this retail tradition, and they did really well with it, so well that they did what everybody does when they can, which is move the hell out of Fresno. And other groups, like I was a big fan of the Hmong. There's a big Hmong community in Fresno. Basically, they were armed mercenaries in the mountains of Southeast Asia. One of the most dangerous things you can do is be like a colonial mercenary for a power that eventually cuts and runs. So we had to fly them back to the U.S., or they would have died in some nasty ways. So there was a big Hmong community there. There are places in Fresno as you drive around where not only can you not read the signs, you can't even guess what language they're in. And a lot of people got pissed off at that when I was growing up, but I thought it was pretty cool.
What's the result of all this mixture then? What does it bring to the place? What effect does it have on the place?
It goes one way or the other. Either people bunker up and hate those alien or, they get to notice, like me, that, hey, this isn't the only way to be. There are other ways to be. And that can be kind of pleasant if you're not having a good time with your own way. And when when I lost God, that was a big deal to my family, and I didn't feel very comfortable in our way anymore. So I just started looking around, reading up on these people, like the Hmong. I used to wonder, what do they think when they walk down the street in Fresno? I mean, these people were fighting night attacks by the North Vietnamese army on little hilltop fortresses with U.S. sky raiders going in low and slow to drop napalm on the slopes. And now they're in Fresno, walking down a street with a mini mall in it. How does that feel?
What do you think they would possibly make of a city like Fresno?
I think for the Vietnamese, it made perfect sense. It was, just they understood cities. But for the Hmong, I used to read a lot about the Hmong, and they were hill people. The ultimate hill people, and that's sort of the same thing whether you're in Appalachia or Southeast Asia. Cities made no sense to them. We kind of played a cruel joke on them, not so much in Fresno, but they also got settled in places like Oakland in housing projects where they didn't understand that was a war zone. A lot of them died. They die just of this thing called, I forget what they call it, dream sickness or something, where they have male Hmong. It doesn't seem to happen to the women. The men have nightmares that are so bad, they just die in their sleep. 25-year-old men. So I think what you're seeing there is they never really learn to handle it until the second generation. The first generation maybe hangs on like they've moved to an alien planet, and those who can't hang on, they just die.
The first generation that goes to a Californian city just dies of nightmares?
Yeah,
Yikes.
Hmongs too. Not Vietnamese, just Hmong.
Why them specifically?
Country people, like way, way, way up in the backwoods. See, and I've talked about this in a couple of columns. In Asia, the pattern is the tribe that wins out takes the river valley because that's where you grow the rice, and the rest become hill people. And people think that these tribes have always been in the hills. No way. Southeast Asia has been as mobile in terms of settlement as like Central Africa. The tribes that are in the hills now are up there because a few hundred years ago they lost out. But after a few generations up in the hills, where you don't meet more than the same 60 people for years and years, you get used to this little teeny quiet Appalachian kind of world. When you're suddenly shoved into a jet and deposited in this giant noisy retail economy, and you're over, say, 15 years old, it's too late to adapt to that.
Getting back to the column itself, you introduced yourself in 2002 as a sort of a war reviewer for the eXile. When you're reviewing a war, how do you approach a war in terms of writing a review of it? What do you look at first?
See, the thing to me is you've got to have the background, or you're just going to get lied to. Most writing on war is lies from one side or another. It's only if you've read everything from every side, like I was doing for years before I did the column, that you can sift through it. Because I don't go to these places. I've never been east of the Rockies. But thanks to the net, I can sift through the stories. And I've usually been reading stories from the same source for years, and so if there's a communique from the rebels saying we killed 200 government troops, I know how much in general they'll be exaggerating, like it means we killed 2 government troops, or we ran away, or something like that. Or in some cases, maybe it means we killed 200 government troops. You got to know that. You got to know whose side you're listening to, and that goes not just, again, that I try to keep it fair. That goes not just for rebel alien sources. It goes for U.S. networks. Like, don't get your main Iraq news from a U.S. network. Go to like the BBC or something. They tend to be a little more honest about it. Don't get your news about, Northern Ireland from the BBC, because they tend to lie about that because it's in their interest. Be aware everybody's lying. Collate your stories and have a background so that you can guess how much lying is going on and what direction they're lying in.
Is that just something that you learned by repeated exposure to these news sources, just figuring out their bias by slow degrees?
I got burned so many times. I started out as a hardware nerd, like most war nerds are. And, in those days, I used to believe DoD briefings, if you can, if you can believe that. Now there's a sucker. But eventually, I realized that some weapons that didn't work tended to get described in certain ways. Like there's an anti-ballistic missile defense that's supposedly in place, but in the first place, we only ordered 11 of them. That's kind of odd. In the second place, there was a weird story that came down from the R&D office that said we will no longer be making public any details of this program. Now, a naive war nerd would read that as, yeah, because it's so secret and we're doing such great stuff. Nuh-uh. When the DoD is doing the right thing and its weapons work, you know about it faster than, like I said in the column, you know faster than Madonna's press agent. When they start clamming up on something, and you know that the science behind it is pretty wonky anyway, which it was, then you know something's gone wrong with the program. You got to read like that. You got to read like you were reading, one of those Soviet newspapers back in the old days. You had to read between the lines.
It sounds like also reading, say, real estate ads when it describes a house with words like cozy or great or a car as sharp. You know you're in for a lemon there. Excellent. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I guess that's one thing that puzzles me about war. Like, people I know are real smart about buying houses, well, most of them, about buying houses and stuff, but they get kind of dumb about buying the stories they hear. Describe for us your self-taught war education. When did it start? How intense has it been? Where'd you go for material?
Most of the boys I knew were into war, It's just later they got into puberty. And I tried to get into puberty too, but, everybody let me know I wasn't, really eligible. So I stuck with war after they quit. Everybody I know grew up reading those Bruce Catton books about the U.S. Civil War, trying to reenact Gettysburg and stuff, and World War II, Battle of the Bulge, Pearl Harbor, that sort of stuff. But most of them, like I said, most of them gave it up when they got interested in other stuff. And I tried to get interested in the other stuff, and they wouldn't have me, so I went back to war. But at that time, I was still a sucker, I guess. I was still reading Jane's, Jane's infantry weapons, Jane's armored personnel carriers, Jane's tanks. Big, back then, they were just big blue reference books at the library. And I hung out at the library all summer because it was cool, and I was a fat kid, and, I didn't get punched around as much in the library. So air conditioning plus not getting punched around, woohoo! That's all I wanted. So I stuck with those books, and that's how I learned my hardware stuff. At that age, when you're a teenager and you got a lot of frustrated sexual energy going on, you can learn anything. I swear to God, I knew every page of every one of those books. Didn't matter at the time. I thought, this is great, but everybody thinks I'm stupid. And then later on, just the habit of soaking up a lot of information in a short time is sort of stuck with me. And when the net came in, it was like the legalization of Gary, man, because then it was like I can soak up everything.
How many hours a day do you spend on the net absorbing that information?
Well, it depends on how much I'm working, but some of the time at work and at least 2-3 hours afterwards. The only other thing I do really is I sometimes watch real-life cop programs, like the first 48 hours. I like that because it shows how murder really works, idiots killing other idiots for stupid reasons. And so it's like a good thing to keep in mind. But the rest of the time, I just surf the war news.
Is crime the same as war in that way? Can you learn the same lessons about material on both things?
There's probably no division between crime and war. There's just sort of a graph. You'll see the more you study guerrilla war that the distinction between a bandit and a guerrilla depends on whose side you're on. If you are against them, they're bandits. If you're for them, they're guerrillas. I mean, even the mafia started out as sort of a resistance group, and that's one of the big dangers for a resistance group. Not only can they start out as crime, they can tilt into crime, even if they started as real resistance group, because suddenly you're like, well, this. We're tough. We got all these guns, and here we are eating grass up in the mountains and freezing our off. Why don't we just, stop that van over there and see what they got in there? It's kind of hard to resist that.
Might as well take it into your own hands at that point if you're in there.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not going to ask this question like some public radio guy saying, "Oh, aren't you ashamed of loving war so much?" I really want to know what's What makes war the most interesting thing to you right now?
Thanks for asking it that way, because I did this NPR thing, and they laughed at me, and that did make me mad. War is what people really. It shows what people really care about, and it shows them in the last resort. It sort of stimulates the mind, you might say. Like, as I've said lots of times, peacetime armies are the dumbest thing in the world, but wartime armies learn incredibly quickly, and they come up with sheer brilliance a lot of the time, and they come up with values that don't come into play anymore, even though every boy I ever knew was raised with them, like heroism and sacrifice. And I know, I'm not dumb. I know that most wars are pretty ugly things, and those things are just ways of getting cannon fodder used up. But there are times when they really do work, like some of the people I used to admire when I was a kid, I still admire. John Paul Jones, saying to the American Navy, "I want a fast ship because I intend to go in harm's way." And the famous line that everybody knows from him, "I have not yet begun to fight." That used to be my sort of motto, because I hadn't. That's the joke about that line. You can read it two ways, like, here, I already kicked your ass and I haven't even begun, or as it was in my case, like, I really haven't. And it means, like, there's a hope that someday I will, because everybody sort of wants to fight back against the world, and war is like the ultimate fighting back. Like George Foreman said about sports, he said something that people laughed at him for, but I like, like boxing is the only real sport, because it's like, suppose I kick your ass, and it doesn't matter if you can run a marathon. War is the ultimate truth about what people will, what they care about, what they'll die for, what they'll kill for.
Would you say it just strips away everything unnecessary about human society and puts it down to the bare minimum?
Yeah, and when it does, you find out that a lot of the things that we believe about society aren't true, like that democracy thing. Not too many people will fight for democracy. A lot of people will fight for the tribe. I guess that's what I mean by tribalism. A lot of people will fight hell for some dumb religious 17th century quibble that we can't even understand anymore. So we learn in a war that things we think matter, the things that we think are universal human stuff, I don't even think they're local human stuff. They're not as important as people like to think. We have a peaceful time in California, and believe me, I'm grateful for growing up in California. I may not say so, but I'm grateful, because we've had other people do the fighting for us. I mean, I asked in one column, who owned the land you live on 300 years ago? Because it probably wasn't your people if you're an American. It was some tribe probably, and they're probably gone now. And I asked that about Fresno, and nobody could even tell me who they were. It was amazing. Nobody.
Do you think that war movies get a lot of this right? You just said about war, about it stripping away everything unnecessary, about getting the... Do they ever get the ideas you have about war on film, or are they all a bunch of BS?
Yeah, I don't like most war films. And when they're true, they're sort of true in the long run and fake in the short run. Like Apocalypse Now was a bunch of nonsense if you looked at it as a story of real Vietnam War combat. But it kind of had an overall good point, which is nobody was paying attention. I mean, that's what you see. I watched that movie again a couple of months ago, and I thought, yeah, that's what he's saying. Nobody except Martin Sheen in that movie is paying any attention to the war. They're all off on some, like the hippies would have said that, on some trip of their own. So I guess it's true in that way. But yeah, most war films are propaganda, and they're not that good. They're just useful, especially guerrilla war. I don't think you can make a movie about guerrilla war because you'd have to show the guerrillas' whole family getting tortured and raped and killed. You'd have to show... I mean, I wrote a column about General Butt Naked of Liberia, who used to send his men into battle wearing platinum blonde wigs, totally naked, and purses, and AK-47s, and that was all. And they'd go into a village, kill everybody, cut off the heads, and use them to play soccer with. And I said, you realize how fake even the supposedly toughest war movies are when you imagine a bunch of coke-head Liberian adolescents naked in platinum blonde wigs playing a game of soccer with some villager's head. I don't think anybody's ever going to make a movie of that.
And that's not even the weirdest, most horrific thing I've heard come out of African wars. What's the deal there?
Well, terror. Once again, there are some good lines in Apocalypse Now. Kurt says, terror is your friend or it is an enemy to be feared. Like, suppose you want to drive an enemy tribe out of the next province so that your tribe can take it over. If you have an air force, you can do what the Brits did in Dresden or we did in Tokyo and just kill everybody. But suppose you don't have that kind of capability, so you just catch 3 women from that tribe and you rape them in the most horrible way you can, and then you kill 2 of them in the most slow, horrible way you can, and you mutilate the third, and this is a real incident that happened in Congo. Mutilate the third and send her home to tell everybody else about it. Well, you've just managed to evacuate that entire province. And if you look at it in cold-blooded military terms, you only had to kill 2 people to do it. You killed them in a pretty awful way, but that wasn't crazy. That was the point.
So when a side doesn't have the resources, doesn't have air power, doesn't have sea power, doesn't have whatever power is applicable, they have to resort to using sheer fear in place of those things.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we use fear too. It's just the fear that we're going to blow your away. This is more like we'll kill you in ways that will make you stay awake at night thinking of them. Because, in a real guerrilla war, people have families. Rambo doesn't have a family, but most guerrillas do. And you have to think not only what will they do to me, what will they do to my daughters, what will they do to my son.
What's your favorite war to study, current or previous?
Well, I'm always going to have a soft spot for the U.S. Civil War. I think it was a magnificent war, fought for a just cause, and fought with honor, if you can say that about any war. And, it's astonishing how little civilian killing there was in most of the Civil War. And I don't say that naively. I know that there are exceptions like the far west, Missouri, Kansas, and I know that, or at least I suspect that, Sherman's boys did some stuff they didn't tell us later on when they went through Georgia and the Carolinas. But basically, a war fought with honor and by very brave troops who started out as complete amateurs and were so good that one of my long-term dreams is, if only some European power had tried to with us around 1864 and we could have united the 2 armies and just gone through them like the proverbial hot knife through butter. But current wars, well, almost current. I'm just amazed by Eritrea, and Ethiopia is also really cool. They fought a war basically in the late 90s, and they fought it in classic nation-building ways because both sides were run by people from Tigray, this minority province in Ethiopia, and the Ethiopian command had been guerrilla allies with the Eritreans, but they had a little dispute about some worthless village and said, well, we'll show our Ethiopian people that we're not soft on Eritrea just because we have the same ethnic background as them. We'll go get in a war with Eritrea. And Eritrea only had 3.5 million people. Ethiopia has 60 million people. But the Eritreans, as I've said, they're like the Prussians of Africa. They're not even an ethnic group. There's no Eritrean ethnic group. But they forged themselves into a nation. They just decided we are going to be a nation and we are going to kick ass. They held off the Ethiopian army for a long time and basically got a stalemate by fighting not an African bush war where you kill a bunch of civilians, but classic 20th century warfare on the Eritrean side because they didn't have the manpower to waste and woman power, to be fair, because women always fought in the Eritrean forces. They went to trench warfare. And on the Ethiopian side, they had a huge arsenal of excellent Soviet armor. So they just rolled over the Eritrean lines eventually, very much Soviet style, using mass attack and firepower.
Is that kind of war now gone forever?
No. One thing I've learned from doing this is nothing's ever gone forever. In fact, one thing I've learned thinking about war is one of the most wrong words people use is die. They say like this or that, nationalism or religion is dead. Only an animal can die. And when you use dead about something other than an animal, you're almost certain to be wrong. So I don't think it's gone forever. It can come back any time. But it's gone for now from the Western world. We don't disagree enough about anything to kill for it. We disagree about some things with other people, but not with each other. I think it's easy to imagine that there'll be something like a World War II between, say, India and China. They're both contending for power on Asian landmass right now, and it's easy to imagine they'll resort to war. It's not easy to predict what that war would look like. Of course, the first question is nukes or no nukes. And that's where it gets so fuzzy. I have no idea.
Do you think it's only a matter of time? No India goes at China or vice versa?
I wouldn't say it's inevitable. Predictions are pretty hopeless, but it's a possibility. And if they don't do it, somebody else will. I mean, the nation versus nation war is a clear model. People understand it, and there are nations that are just building, like Eritrea and Ethiopia. It's the young age of the world in those days. Like I said in a column, it's like there are tectonic plates in nation building, and some places the world is still hot. Europe has gone so cold they won't have that kind of war ever, maybe. But other places are young and enthusiastic. They've got all the ingredients. They've got an economy heating up. They've got a strong religion. They've got a high birth rate. They're in the mood. And if you see some of these Indian websites about, like, the Kargil incident where India and Pakistan fought way up in the Himalayas, you'd be blown away by the 1914 style rhetoric, like, our brave heroes have liberated the lines above whatever. I can't even pronounce the name.
And another point of interest you've had recently, or another conflict you've kept up with, would be what's going on in Sri Lanka. And why has that attracted you so much? It
bridges the gap, for one thing, between guerrilla and conventional armies. The Tamil Tigers, like I called them in that column, were terrorists with an air force. They actually control areas of territory, or they did until recently, and they have actually carried out air raids against Sri Lankan oil refineries and I think military bases. I'm not sure. They also have a very serious navy, and they had a full-on battle between their fast gunboats and Sri Lankan, I think, destroyers recently. So they're like the missing link between irregular and conventional warfare.
Because usually you wouldn't see a group of their kind flying planes around, right? You'd see them maybe poking eyeballs out, but they wouldn't be dive bombing.
No, it takes an awful lot of infrastructure to maintain an air force, an awful lot. In fact, I remember hearing somewhere somewhere online, somebody was saying this cynical quote they got from somewhere: terrorism is violence by people who don't have an air force. Because one of the weird things you notice about war these days is it's never really bad if you do it from an airplane. I don't know why, but that's just how people think. If you're on the ground getting your eyes blown out or your leg blown off, it probably seems pretty bad. But we don't see it that way.
How did the Tigers get so powerful that they were able to do what they do?
Well, they're one of these lucky ethnic groups that has friends. I mean, Tamils are the dominant group in South India. They always have had some presence in Sri Lanka, but they were brought in big numbers by the British to work on the plantations. The British actually shipped Tamils all over the world. It was like outsourcing before the computer age. You actually had to bring the workers, and they would work for nothing, and they worked hard. So they got set up there, and they had friends back on the mainland. And the group they were fighting, the Sinhalese, has basically no links anywhere, and it's the odd group out in India because it's the one tribe that's Buddhist. There are some Sinhalese Christians and even Muslims. Most of them are Buddhists. And, Buddhism used to be the religion in India. It came from India, but it lost out to Hinduism. So the Sinhalese are relatively weak, and for a local underdog, in the bigger sense, the Tamils are the regional overdog, right? But the Sinhalese just have the dominant position on the island. So the Tamils were able to call on their friends back in the mainland for money and smuggling help.
Moving on a little to the front of the world stage, what do you think about Iran? What would you do with Iran?
Kill them with kindness. Obviously, we can't attack them. I mean, I think it's pretty clear by now. Cheney's pulled every lever he can think of to try to get the Air Force to attack Iran, and they just said, well, what I imagine they said. I don't know, but what I would say is, you idiot. We listened to you once before. It's pretty clear that we're not going to do that. What are the options? I mean, when there's a power that hates you, and Iran does hate us, although it's tricky. They think we're just kind of dumb and obnoxious. It's the British they're really afraid of. It's interesting. They think the British are a lot smarter than we are. You basically have to either nuke them or bribe them once again, and we're not going to nuke them, or even bomb them with conventional weapons. I think the best thing might be to encourage that bourgeois youth in Iran, like drop massive bombings of iPods, and just hope that Ahmadinejad's talk about austerity and Islam pisses them off after a while and they get rid of him. I don't think there's any direct pressure, and Iran is one of those places that has a big educated population. They were great soldiers in the Iran-Iraq War, very willing to die. They have a big population. They're a very big ethnic group. They're I think about 80% of the Iranian population is actually ethnic Iranian. And I don't think there's any way that you can hurt them directly that would do us any good. What you would do if you attack them directly is make the Ahmadinejad faction stronger because they'd be the country's defenders. What you want to do is make them ridiculous and irrelevant. If I was president, I'd start learning Farsi and have myself photographed doing Iranian dances and whatever. It might not be popular stateside, but it's the best way right now. Make the place so bourgeois that they toss him out. And there is a trend that way. There's a lot of rich young Iranians, in California, who want to go back and disco all night. And I don't know if people are willing to kill for that. But they might. The disco revolution, I don't know.
This is one country dealing with which the war nerd says war is not the answer. It's going to be maybe ridicule or maybe bribery then.
Yeah, we could nuke it. Once again, nukes are always sort of floating in the background here, like an option on your computer, like nuke now. We could annihilate Iran, and it's been done. The Mongols annihilated northeast Iran. It was their most brutal conquest of all. And they smashed the irrigation system so that nobody's ever really been able to farm there again. It could be done. And with nukes, it could be done very easily. But at the moment, for reasons I don't fully understand myself, that's off the table. I guess I'm advocating a kind of hard realism. Look, you could nuke them. Are you going to nuke them? No, you're not. If you're not going to nuke them, play nice.
And what would you do about the ultimate hornet's nest, and that is, of course, North Korea?
Yeah, that one seems like a good case for attack. I mean, like, if we're going to attack somebody, North Korea seems like a good candidate. Just see how deep Kim's support goes in a population that's half-starved and has never seen the modern world. Let's see how well they'd fight against a high-tech, no ground troop style attack. I have never understood the U.S. reaction to North Korea. Time and again, we've let ourselves get humiliated by them. And we never do a thing. I remember when I was a kid, they chopped up 2 American officers in the truce village with axes. And we didn't do a thing. I couldn't believe it. Like, aren't we going to at least shell a barracks or something? Throw me a bone here. But we never do. I guess South Korea has become important enough to the U.S. economy that we don't want to piss them off. And they have this weird love-hate thing with North Korea. It's like your crazy mass murderer brother in the attic, but if the cops come, you'll fight tooth and claw to keep them from getting him.
You think the South just fears that the North is going to roll over the DMZ and start shelling?
No, I think they fear that we'll roll over it and hurt their crazy relatives up there. I don't think they really fear the North. And I think as a conventional force, they might be right. I think the North Korean army might not have it in them to take the South. But most of all, I think they're like the Germans. They've suffered a loss as horrible as the Germans. The losses in the Korean War for Koreans were horrendous. And they're dealing with Seoul being, 10 miles from the border? They can't afford a war. It's a cramped little peninsula that's getting very rich. The last thing you want is to have to go back to being starved peasants in the middle of a war without mercy on either side.
There was a fascinating point you made in at least one of your columns, where you said that the North has good enough agents that if they're going to use nukes, they have already hidden them in the U.S. Do you think that's true?
I would. That's all I can say. I would. I would if I were Mao. I wouldn't rely on rockets. I mean, what do Marxist-Leninist regimes do well? They do spies. They do covert operations. That and mass execution are about the only things they're good at. So if you've got the nukes, why rely on some 10th-rate Yugo of an ICBM, to get them, when the U.S. is a wide-open country? Until 2001, U.S. borders were the joke of the world. They were the most wide-open borders in the world. To the point that, and this still blows me away, the Air Force, when they asked why they were going to have their fighters ram that fourth jet because there were no air-to-air missiles available to shoot it down with, when somebody said, why weren't you prepared for that? It's like, well, we hadn't thought about defending U.S. borders. That gave North Korea, China, I don't think Russia, but maybe Russia, about 40 years to wrap a few nukes in lead and drop them from the hull of a freighter, say, a half mile off the San Diego docks. That works for me. I don't know that they did do it, but I guarantee they thought about it.
What do you think about, let's say, a wild card? What do you think about Venezuela? Are they a threat?
No, not to... No. I mean, the threat is they have oil. I mean, people are worried about the wrong stuff. Oil and birth rate. They have a high birth rate and they have a lot of oil. That's a threat. As a military force, no way. Reminds me of Red Dawn, when I was a kid. And it's like, ooh, the Sandinistas are going to come up and take Colorado. I mean, I love that movie. And I watched it every weekend for a long time. But I don't quite buy it.
There's going to be no Venezuelans parachuting down into the football field or anything?
No. Oh. There's going to be Venezuelans embarrassing us and showing off by sending heating oil to the poor folks in Massachusetts. I don't know if you'd call that a threat.
Toward the end of the book, you include a column where you envision a future of war where it's a lot of unmanned aerial vehicles versus a lot of unmanned aerial vehicles, if you're talking big nation versus big nation, or a lot of unmanned aerial vehicles versus essentially cavemen throwing rocks in other nations. Could you describe a little bit about what might bring us there?
As countries get richer, more developed, whatever you want to call it, by and large, and I know there are a lot of exceptions to this, by and large, they don't feel as willing to die as nation-states in an earlier stage were. Like around 1800, it's not that hard to get people from Europe to die. Even around 1900 or 1914, it's not that hard to get them to die. But after 1918, it's a little harder in some places, like in France and Britain, but it's still easy in places like Germany and Russia, which is why those countries had a big advantage militarily. They were more willing to die. I think Americans are still fairly willing to die in that way, but they're not crazy about it, about dying in the hundreds of thousands the way they would in a conventional war with another major state. So you look for ways to reduce casualties, and that's why the Israelis have been the leaders in remotely piloted vehicle technology, because the one weakness of the Israeli army, well, maybe they have a couple of weaknesses, but the biggest weakness is that they have a small population, rather tight-knit population, and they don't like casualties. That's why they developed the remotely piloted stuff that the U.S. Air Force had invented and put all the money into inventing. The U.S. Air Force didn't think they were sexy enough. It was big manned fighters that made loud noises and blew things up. That was sexy. The Israelis couldn't afford to worry about that. So they went for RPVs, and they sent them in instead of manned fighters to scout out terrain, see where the enemy was, provoke Syrian air defenses in 1982 into premature strikes that revealed the locations, and then they could use HARM missiles, high-speed anti-radar missiles, to home in on the Syrian air defense radar. And they ended up completely destroying the Syrian Air Force without losing a single plane. So that's what showed what could be done. Now, if you're a big country facing a situation where trade reasons or whatever force you to go to war, but your population doesn't want to take casualties, and if both countries are in that situation, both countries are at the same level of not wanting to die, then you could easily end up having a war with nothing but RPVs. Of course, that posits like two countries that are just equally unwilling to die. Usually one or the other will say, well, okay, you blew all our RPVs out of the sky, well, you, and we're going to nuke your cities. But everybody's always talking about the nukes, the nukes, the nukes. The nukes haven't happened. It's time to face that reality. The nukes have not come out. So if the nukes don't come out, there's little point in bloodletting between two big Western powers. So it might just come down to RPV versus RPV.
If a big power gets involved in a war with a smaller one, it's just RPVs shredding people, essentially?
We're doing that now. That's what a Predator is.
Yeah.
You know, the Predator drone. We have our Predator hovering for a week over some mud village in northern Pakistan until we see from the camera on the Predator that Mr. X has gotten in his Jeep Cherokee and is heading off to a meeting. And the SUV just gets blown to bits. It's very easy. There's no possibility of U.S. prisoners being taken, and it's incredibly cheap because nobody is up there in the Predator.
Now, one last thing to ask you. The newspaper in which your column is published, the eXile, has had some trouble recently being looked at by the, of course, Russian government. Is it coming out the other side okay, or?
Well, that's what they tell me, but I don't know. I never had much to do with that. I've met Ames a couple of times, but that's all. And I don't know. I tend to assume the worst. So they say it's going to be a new website called eXiled with a D at the end. But, you know, they weren't even able to pay anybody for the last couple.
But we'll still keep seeing War Nerd for a little while, right?
Somewhere, yeah. I need the money. Yeah.
The name of the book, once again, War Nerd, same as the column from Soft Skull Press. Gary Brecher, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the program.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed the interview.
Read Gary Brecher's War Nerd columns at eXile.ru. Our music is composed by Ben Althouse. Check out his website, Ben Althouse, that's BenAlthouse.com. For more information and our online show archive, visit colinmarshallradio.com.